Hello students, welcome to this lecture on the course Principles of Political Science. Today's lecture is on the nature of political science. Is it a science or an art? In our last lecture, we explored the meaning and definition of political science, what it is, where the word comes from, and how thinkers from Aristotle to David Easton defined it. Today, we build directly on that foundation. Now that we know that political science is a natural question, we know what political science is. Natural question arises: what kind of discipline it is? Is it a science like physics or chemistry, or is it more like an art depending on judgment, values, intuitions, and interpretations? This question about the nature of discipline is extremely important. It tells us how the subject should be studied, what methods are appropriate, and what kind of conclusions we can draw. Today's lecture follows a clear logical sequence. We begin by understanding what do we mean by the nature of a discipline. Then we study the characteristics of science and check whether the discipline of political science fulfill those conditions. We look at arguments both in favor and against political science being called science. We then explore political science as an art and study the views of Aristotle, Auguste Comte and Max Weber. We examine scientific methods used in political science and their limitations. We explore the role of values and human behavior. Finally, we arrive at a balanced conclusion. Let us begin with an open and analytical mind today. Before we ask whether political science is a science or an art, we must understand what do we mean by the discipline of the nature. First, what kind of knowledge does the subject produce? Is it objective and verifiable or subjective and interpretive? Second, what methods does this subject use to study its subject matter? Observation, examination, logical reasoning, or intuition? Third, can the findings of this discipline be generalized? Can we make universal statements that hold true across different times and places? These three questions, what kind of knowledge it produces? Secondly, what methods does this subject use to study? And thirdly, how the findings of the discipline can be generalized. So these three questions about knowledge, method, and generalizability together define the nature of any discipline. Physics, for example, produces objective, verifiable, and generalizable knowledge using controlled experiment. We call it natural science. Literature, on the other hand, produces interpretive knowledge, depending on human beings, their own creativity, judgment, and cultural context. We call it an art. Political science sits somewhere between these two extremes of natural science and the social science or the art discipline, the discipline that belong to the art. We see that understanding the nature of political science means honestly examining what kind of knowledge it produces, what methods it uses, and what limitations it faces. Political science deals with human behavior, institutions, and power, subjects that are real and observable, yet complex and resistant to exact measurement. To evaluate whether political science qualifies as a science, we must first clearly understand what makes a discipline scientific. Scholars of the philosophy of science have identified several defining characteristics. The first is systematic observation. A science must study its subject matter through careful structural observation rather than guesswork. The second is hypothesis formation. A scientist formulates a testable statement and designs a method to test it. Third is controlled experimentation. Natural sciences conduct experiments in controlled conditions where variables can be isolated and measured precisely. The fourth is the formulation of generalizable laws. Once patterns are consistently observed, scientists arrive at laws that apply universally. The fifth is objectivity. Scientific knowledge must be free from personal bias. Sixth is the verifiability. Other scientists must be able to repeat the same process and arrive at the same result independently. The seventh is predictability. A true science must be able to predict future events based on established laws. These characteristics define what scholars call a positive science. When we ask whether political science is a science, we are essentially asking, does it successfully meet these 7 criteria? This is a rigorous test, and the answer, as we shall discover, is both interesting and nuanced. Let us now carefully apply these criteria to our discipline of political science. Now that we have identified the characteristics of science, let us honestly examine whether political science meets those standards. This is a critical question that scholars have debated for over a century. Let us go through the key criteria. On systematic observation, yes, political science does observe political phenomena systematically. Political sciences study election, governance, and political behavior in a structured and rigorous manner. On hypothesis formation, yes, again, a researcher may hypothesize that higher literacy rates lead to a greater voter turnout, and then test this using data from Indian elections. However, at the criteria of controlled experimentation, political science faces its first serious difficulty. You cannot place a country in a laboratory and control all variables and test a political theory. Political phenomena occur in the laboratory of world. They do not occur in controlled settings. On the formulation of universal laws, political science again falls short. What holds true in one society may not apply in another one. On objectivity, researchers often bring ideological assumptions into their work. On predictability, political science has a mixed record. It can identify trends, but rarely predict events with precision. So the honest answer is political science partly meets scientific criteria, but not completely. This partial fulfillment is precisely at the heart of the debate we are exploring today in this lecture. Despite the limitations just discussed, there are strong and well-supported arguments in favor of treating political science as a science. The first and most important argument is that political science uses scientific methods. Modern political scientists use quantitative research. They collect large data sets, apply statistical tools, and conduct surveys to study political behavior or political phenomena. This demonstrates a genuine scientific orientation. The second argument is that political science has developed verifiable theories and generalizations. The democratic peace theory, which argues that democratic nations rarely go to war with each other, has been tested and supported by large amounts of historical data. This is exactly the kind of generalized knowledge that science produces. The third argument is that political science seeks objectivity and value neutrality. Max Weber, whose views we will study in detail shortly, argued that social scientists must strive to separate facts and values in their analysis. This commitment to objectivity is a scientific aspiration. The fourth argument is that political science has progressively adopted more rigorous methods over time. The behavioral revolution of 1950s and 60s, which we briefly touched upon in lecture 1, brought empirical precision and scientific rigor to our discipline. These developments have genuinely strengthened the scientific credentials of political science and demonstrate its capacity for growth and intellectual maturity as an academic discipline. One of the most passionate advocates for making social studies scientific was the French philosopher Auguste Comte. One of the most passionate advocates for making social studies scientific was the French philosopher Auguste Comte, who lived from 1798 to 1857. Comte is widely regarded as the father of sociology, but his ideas profoundly influenced political science as well. Comte coined the term positivism, which became one of the most influential intellectual movements in the history of social science. According to his positivist philosophy, all genuine knowledge must be based on observable facts and empirical evidence. He believed that human societies, like natural phenomena, are governed by laws discoverable through systematic observation and scientific inquiry. Kant envisioned a science of society, which he initially called social physics, that would discover the laws governing human social and political behavior, just as Newton discovered the laws of physical motion. He argued that as human civilization progressed, it would replace theology and metaphysics with positive science as the basis for understanding the world. For political science, Kant's vision was tremendously inspiring. It suggested that politics, governance, and social behavior could be studied with the same rigor and precision as the natural world. Kant's positivism gave political scientists the intellectual ambition to develop their discipline as a genuine science and move beyond a purely philosophical approach to political inquiry. His legacy continues to influence empirical political research today. While there are strong arguments in favor, equally powerful arguments exist against treating political science, as a full-fledged science. These objections are not merely academic, they point to genuine and fundamental limitations of applying the scientific methods to political phenomena. The first and foremost fundamental objection is the impossibility of controlled experimentation. In natural science, variables can be isolated in a laboratory, but in political science, the subject matter is human society. The object of study is human being himself, and you cannot conduct experiments on nations, governments, or political conflicts under controllable conditions. Every political situation is embedded in a complex web of history, culture, economics, and psychology. The second objection concerns universality. Scientific laws apply everywhere and at all times, but political conclusions are highly variable. They are highly context dependent. What explains stability in India may not explain the same in Sweden or Nigeria. The third objection is the problem of objectivity. Political scientists hold ideological beliefs and personal values that inevitably influence how they frame research questions, interpret data, and draw conclusions. Pure objectivity is extremely difficult to achieve because human values, human mindset, human way of thinking appears in between, and every human thinks in a different way. The fourth objection is the lack of predictability. Despite decades of sophisticated research, political science has frequently failed to predict major events, revolutions, electoral upsets, and regime collapse. And these failures raise genuine questions about the discipline's scientific status and its capacity to function like a natural science. One of the deepest challenges to treating political science as a pure science is the inescapable role of values and ethics in political inquiry. Unlike natural phenomena or rocks, atoms, or stars, political phenomena are not value neutral. Every political question involves judgments about what is right, what is just, and what kind of society is worth living in. Consider a simple example. When we study poverty in India, we are not just counting people below the poverty line. We are also making, implicit judgment. We are also making implicit judgment about whether this is acceptable, whose responsibility is it to address it, and what policies are desirable. These are value-laden judgments. No data alone can resolve it. This is why political science has a normative dimension. It is not only about explaining what is, but also about prescribing what ought to be. Human behavior adds another layer of complexity. Human beings are not predictable like physical objects. They are motivated by irrational passions, cultural beliefs, religious convictions, and prejudices that resist scientific measurements. Max Weber recognized this deeply. He argued that while social scientists must strive for value neutrality, That is Wortfreiheit in factual analysis. The very choice of what to study is always influenced by values. This tension between objectivity and human values lies at the heart of the debate about political science nature. Max Weber, the great German sociologist and political thinker who lived from 1864 to 1920, made one of the most nuanced contributions to the debate about the scientific status of political science. Weber did not simply argue that political science is or not a science. Instead, he offered a sophisticated position, acknowledging both scientific aspirations and inherent limitations of social scientific inquiry. Weber introduced two critical concepts. The first is Max Weber introduced two critical concepts. The first is Verstehen, a German word meaning interpretive understanding. Weber argued that studying human social and political behavior requires not just external observations, but genuine empathetic understanding of the meaning that human actors attach to their own action. This is fundamentally different from studying physical objects which have no specific inner life. The second concept is Wortfreiheit, meaning value freedom. Weber acknowledged that social scientists inevitably bring value to their work, particularly in choosing what problems to study. However, once a research question is chosen, analysis must proceed with strict objectivity and must not be distorted by personal preferences or ideological commitments. Weber's position represents a valuable middle path. Social science, including political science, can be scientific in its methods and rigorous in its analysis, but it cannot fully escape the role of meaning, values, and interpretation. This balanced view remains highly influential in political science today. Having examined the scientific credentials of political science extensively, let us now turn to the other side. The idea that political science is fundamentally an art. What do we mean by an art? An art is a field of knowledge that relies primarily on human judgment, experience, intuition, and wisdom rather than fixed formulas or universal laws. It cannot be reduced to rules mechanically applied. It requires the practitioner to exercise discretion, creativity, and context-sensitive understanding. When we examine political science through this lens, we find compelling reasons to consider it an art. First, political decision making in the real world depends enormously on judgment and wisdom rather than mechanical application of scientific rules. A skilled politician or diplomat must read solutions, understand human emotions, navigate cultural sensitivities, and respond creatively to unpredictable events. None of this can be captured in a formula. Second, interpreting political events require deep understanding of history, culture, language, and human motivations, qualities that are artistic in nature. Consider how different scholars interpret the emergency period in India from 1975 to 77. Their interpretation differed dramatically based on theoretical frameworks, ideological commitments, and normative judgments. This diversity of interpretation is a hallmark of art, not science. Political science thus depends on forms of understanding that scientific methods alone cannot fully provide. We met Aristotle in lecture 1 as the father of political science. Now let us revisit his ideas in the context of today's debate about the nature of political science. Aristotle's perspective is particularly valuable because he was amongst the first thinkers to seriously reflect on what kind of knowledge politics involves. For Aristotle, political science, which he called politic, was not a theoretical science like mathematics or logic. It was not about deriving eternal truths through pure reason. Instead, Aristotle placed political science in the category of practical science. Discipline, dealing with human action, choice, and conduct in real-world situations. The key concept is phronesis. The Greek word for the Greek word for practical wisdom. Phronesis is not the same as theoretical knowledge. It is the ability to deliberate carefully about what is good for human beings in particular circumstances and to make wise judgments even without universal rules. Aristotle believed that political wisdom, the ability to govern well, design just institutions and promote the common good, is precisely this practical, wisdom. It cannot be taught through abstract formulas or scientific laws. It is cultivated through experience, moral reflection, and deep engagements with the human affairs. In this sense, Aristotle was among the first to argue that politics is fundamentally an art and a morally serious one. While we have acknowledged scientific significant limitations of treating political science as a pure science, it is equally important to recognize the genuine scientific methods that modern political science does not employ. The recognition is essential for a balanced and accurate picture of the discipline. Modern political science uses several research methods that are genuinely scientific in nature. In character. The first is the survey method. Political scientists conduct large-scale surveys to measure public opinion, voter preferences, and political attitudes. In India, organizations like Lokniti at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies conduct regular electoral surveys, providing valuable scientific data about Indian democracy. The second is statistical analysis. Political scientists use sophisticated statistical techniques to analyze patterns in political data. For example, relationships between economic inequality and political instability. The third is the comparative method, systematically comparing political institutions and processes across countries to identify patterns and test hypotheses about what conditions favor democracy or effective governance. The fourth is the historical method, studying political events over time to identify patterns of change and continuity. The fifth is the case study of research, in-depth investigation of a single country, institution, or political events to derive theoretical insights. These methods, when applied carefully and systematically, give political science a genuinely scientific character and demonstrate its capacity for rigorous empirical inquiry. Despite genuine scientific methods used in political science, important and unavoidable limitations exist. Like the first limitation is the complexity and uniqueness of political phenomena. The situation is embedded in a unique historical and cultural context. Unlike physical phenomena following universal laws, political phenomena resist simple generalization. What explains democratic success in one country may not apply to another country. The second limitation is the absence of controlled experimentation or controlled experiments. In political science, we cannot isolate and manipulate variables under controlled condition. Political events happen in the complex real world where hundreds of variables operate simultaneously, making it very difficult to establish clean causal relationship. The third limitation is the problem of measurements. Concepts central to political science like power, legitimacy, justice, political culture, they all are notoriously difficult to measure precisely. Unlike the boiling point of power of water, these concepts do not yield to simple quantitative measurements. The fourth limitation is the role of values. Research in political science is inevitably influenced by the ideological and normative commitments of the researcher. These limitations do not invalidate political science. They remind us that it is a social science with its own distinctive character, not a natural science with universal laws and perfect predictability. One of the most significant attempts to make political science genuinely scientific was the behavioral revolution or behavioralism movement, which emerged prominently in the United States during the 1950s and 60s. Behavioral scholars believed that earlier political science had been too focused on formal institutions, legal texts, and normative philosophy, and too little focus on the actual behavior of the political actors. They argued that political science must study what politicians, voters, administrators, and citizens actually do rather than what constitutions and laws say they should do. So, behavioralists insisted that political science must become empirical, grounded in systematic observation of actual political behavior using rigorous quantitative methods. Key figures associated with this movement are Robert Dell, David Easton, Gabriel Almond. Gabriel Almond and Sidney Verber introduced the concept of political culture, the shared values, beliefs, and attitudes of a society towards politics as a scientifically measurable variable shaping political outcomes. The behavioralist movement significantly raised methodological standards in political science, but it also faced criticism from different sources. The behavioralism movement was enormously influential in making political science more rigorous and empirical. However, by the late 1950s, a powerful reaction had developed against it, and that was known as post-behavioralism. This reaction was led by scholars who felt that single-minded pursuit of scientific rigor had caused political science to lose sight of its most important responsibilities. The post-behavioralist critique was most famously articulated by David Easton himself, the very scholar who had been a leading figure of the behavioral revolution. In the 1969 presidential address to the American Political Science Association, Easton argued that political science had become so obsessed with methodological precision that it had grown irrelevant to real political crises, including the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and deepening global poverty. Easton called for a return to relevance and values in political science. He argued that political scientists have a responsibility to engage with urgent political problems rather than hide behind methodological neutrality. Post-behavioralism did not reject empirical methods entirely. Rather, it insisted that rigorous methodology must be combined with a commitment to addressing real political problems and acknowledging the role of values in inquiry. Now that we have examined both sides of the debate, we can present a balanced view of political science as both science and art. When treated as a science, it relies on systematic methods such as surveys, statistical analysis, comparative research, hypothesis testing. It helps identify patterns, build theories, and produce evidence-based conclusions, striving for objectivity and generalization. When it is viewed as an art, political science highlights the human dimension of politics. It involves values, judgments, and interpretations that cannot be fully captured by data alone. So we see that the most balanced conclusion is that political science combines both the most balanced, science and art. It uses scientific methods while operating in a world shaped by human values, cultural meanings, and moral choices. Ignoring either dimension weakens our understanding of this complex, discipline. One of the most useful ways to resolve the political science versus art debate is to recognize that political science belongs to a distinct category. It is a social science. The concept is crucial because it occupies a genuine middle ground between natural science and humanities. Social sciences, including political science, sociology, economics, and psychology, study human beings and their organized social life. They use many methods of natural science, observation, data collection, hypothesis testing, and statistical analysis, but they study a fundamentally different subject, human beings who think, feel, choose, communicate, create cultures, and construct meanings. They are not fixed. They are not static. This distinctiveness means social science faces challenges that natural science do not. Human behavior is not governed by fixed laws. It is shaped by history, culture, language, and ideology. Social phenomena are therefore more variable and more resistant to prediction than physical phenomena. At the same time, social sciences are more rigorous rather than purely artistic inquiry. They seek to identify patterns, test hypotheses, and develop cumulative knowledge. Recognizing political science as a social science helps us set appropriate standards, as rigorous as possible in methods, as objective as possible in analysis, and as relevant as possible to real political challenges of human societies, particularly in complex democracies like India, where politics and societies are deeply intertwined. Let us consolidate what we have discussed today. We began by understanding what it means to ask about the nature of a discipline and identified the key characteristics of a true science: observation, hypothesis, experimentation, universal laws, objectivity, verifiability, and predictability. We honestly evaluated whether political science meets these criteria and found it partially does, but faces significant limitation. We examined strong arguments in favor of political science as a science, systematic methods, testable theories, and empirical rigor. We studied Auguste Comte's positivist vision, which inspired political scientists to aspire towards scientific precision. On the other side, we examined compelling arguments against treating political science as a pure science: the impossibility of controlled experiments, the problems of values, and the absence of universal laws. We studied Max Weber's nuanced position on value neutrality and interpretive understanding. We explored Aristotle's views that political science is fundamentally practical wisdom and art. We traced the rise of behavioralism and post-behavioralism. We examined the Indian context and found political science there is naturally both science and art. Our balanced conclusion is clear. Political science is best understood as a social science, combining the rigor of scientific methods with the wisdom, judgment, and values characteristic of an art. This is an honest and mature understanding. Thank you.